Chicago has always been a city of superlatives. In transportation, it was the greatest railway hub of the nation. It had the world's largest horse car system, the world's largest cable car system, and the world's largest streetcar system. It is the city of the broad shoulders.
The fascinating and extremely complex history of public transit in Chicago began, as it did in many other cities and towns, with horse cars. The first transit lines began in 1858, with horses pulling little four-wheeled trams, a matter of a few blocks. Later, the rails ran out in three directions to the edges of the city. As the horse plodded the years away, a better form of city transit was built in San Francisco, the cable car. Chicago officials went to see the cars, which hooked onto a moving cable buried in a trough in the street, and they were sold. Chicago had to have a cable car system. In 1881, the Chicago City Railway Company obtained a franchise from the city fathers, and cable cars replaced the horse-drawn cars on State Street and southward on the Wabash Cottage Grove line. The cable car system expanded until Chicago had the largest cable car system in the world. The South Side cable line eventually ran as far south as 71st Street, and the cable cars were one of the routes used to reach the city's first great international fair, the Columbian Exposition of 1893. By that time, the first line of the elevated railway system had reached the fairgrounds, giving fairgoers a second travel option. If that weren't enough, the only whaleback steamboat ever built to carry passengers, the Christopher Columbus, ran from downtown to Jackson Park, the site of the fair, while the Illinois Central Railroad's suburban trains ran from the south edge of the loop to the fairgrounds. The first electric streetcars came to Chicago in 1890 on the Calumet Electric Street Railway operating on the city's far south side. During the decade of the gay 90s, the electric cars steadily replaced horse and cable operations. Small, four-wheel cars, open in summer and closed, but often unheated, in winter, were spreading throughout the city. Competition among the several companies resulted in a chaotic patchwork network that only replaced the last cable and horse cars in 1906. Public pressure brought about the consolidation in 1914 of the four major competitors under one management, the Chicago Surface Lines. Under the unified management, the system grew quickly, and new double-truck cars replaced the old four-wheelers. It wasn't long before the system became the world's largest, with the longest line on one street, Western Avenue, stretching from Howard Street on the north side over 23 miles to 111th Street on the south side. Many of the routes had their own flavor, and in the case of the Halsted Street line, its own smell, from the enormous Union Stockyards south of 39th Street. The character of this line was detailed by Chicago's Carl Sandburg in his poem, The Halsted Streetcar. Although many builders supplied streetcars to Chicago, a large share were constructed along similar lines, and to a layman looked pretty much alike. But nicknames, official or unofficial, served to help differentiate the numerous types. Old Pullmans, new Pullmans, pressed steels, matchboxes, bowling alleys, turtlebacks, flexible flyers, sewing machines, sun parlors, Peter Witts or sedans, little brills, big brills, near sides or muzzle loaders, and multiple units were some of the names given to pre-PCC cars. 1936 PCC cars were called Blue Geese for their unique blue paint job. The Pullmans, both old and new, totaled 950 cars and became the image most remembered of Chicago's red and cream streetcars.
They were also the last non-PCC cars to run in service and were used by rail fans on numerous special trips in their last years. The 3 streetcar tunnels under the Chicago River were regularly used by some routes and by others only when the bridges were open. The last in service was the Washington Street Tunnel that brought Madison Street and Milwaukee Avenue cars into the loop. During the 1920s, Surface Line's ridership expanded greatly. Motor trailer trains were used for shift change traffic at major industrial plants such as Western Electric. New cars continued to be bought or built by the CSL's own shops. The Depression of the 1930s brought an end to increasing ridership and new equipment, and brought more talk of municipal ownership. The 1933 and 1934 Century of Progress exposition along the lake, south of the Loop, brought a flood of visitors to the city and riders to the streetcars. The Roosevelt Road line was extended into Grant Park on a trestle, over the Illinois Central's tracks, and through the train shed of Central Station. The Cermak Road line was also extended eastward across the Illinois Central and then north to a new terminal at 18th Street. Both terminals were also used by cars of other routes that were diverted to the fairgrounds. Five years before World War II, Chicago Surface Lines purchased its first PCC, or President's Conference Committee cars. The fast, quiet, streamlined cars were painted blue and cream. Until after the war, they operated only on Madison Street. The war years saw the Surface Lines operating 3,600 streetcars, serving the new war industry employees and many others who had to turn to public transportation when gasoline and tires were rationed. Immediately following the war, the CSL ordered more PCC cars, 600 more. At 50 feet long and 9 feet wide, they were the largest PCC streetcars ever built.
These cars, later dubbed Green Hornets, served less than 10 years on the city's streets. 570 of the 600 were sold to the St. Louis Car Company, who stripped them and used the parts in new rapid transit cars. This car is the last survivor of the 600.
Chicago's PCCs were unique in not having foot pedal control when delivered. Only when converted for one-man operation, where the operator needed to make change and handle transfers, were the hand control levers replaced with pedals. The triple stream main entrance doors of the post-war cars, giving access to the rear conductor's station, were unique as well, and were a major difference from the pre-war cars with their triple stream front doors and centrally located conductor. During the war, work had progressed on a plan for municipal ownership of the streetcar and rapid transit systems, and in October 1947, the Chicago Transit Authority, the CTA, took over all operations of the surface lines. With the end of war rationing, the personal automobile again siphoned riders away from the streetcars, and the first conversions to bus operation occurred. It was planned to keep the heaviest and longest lines as streetcar operations, but the worsening street congestion and shrinking ridership caused a change in the plans. As the 1950s rolled on, only the four heaviest lines were left: Cottage Grove, Broadway State, Western Avenue, and Clark Wentworth. These were served by the PCC fleet and a part of the old Pullman Group. The economies of bus lines, where no overhead wire and no track had to be maintained, finally did in the streetcars. The Cottage Grove line went in mid-1955. Late in that year, the Broadway State route was gone. Late 1956 saw the end of the Western Avenue line. in June of 1958, the Wentworth line ran its last cars, and the streetcar era in Chicago was over. Though streetcars were gone, electric vehicles continued to roll another 15 years on Chicago's streets. In 1930, the surface lines won a franchise battle to serve Chicago's rapidly growing northwest side, beyond the end of the streetcar lines. 7 new feeder routes were called for initially, and the surface lines elected to equip them for trolley coach operation. The Twin Coach Company supplied the first vehicles that opened the Diversey Avenue line on April 17, 1930. 3 more lines went into service in 1930, and the last 3 in 1931. Coaches were ordered from the same companies that built streetcars, and over 150 were running by 1938. Following the CTA takeover in 1947, a number of major crosstown lines were converted from streetcars to trolley coaches, and hundreds more trolleys were bought. The largest order was for 349 coaches from the Marmon Harrington Company, which pushed the all-time roster of trolleys to over 700. The mid-1950s found the trolley coach network at its peak, with 16 routes and nearly 700 coaches in operation. But in 1959, the gradual conversion to motor buses began. The end of electric surface transportation came in March 1973, when the last 3 routes were converted to diesel buses. As surface transportation had gone from electric propulsion to internal combustion, the rapid transit lines were growing larger and stronger. During construction of the subway lines in the late 1930s, scenes such as this were not unusual in Chicago, with streetcars shunted around construction zones on shoe-fly tracks. But the subway was a latecomer. The elevated tracks had been around since the Great Fair of 1893. At first, the trains of wooden cars were pulled by little steam engines, the first 20 of which have been pictured in a famous photograph of 1892. That was when a train of the little compound engines was hauled to Chicago from the Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia. Motion pictures of the Chicago elevated trains being pulled by steam power are not known to exist, though still shots do exist. Films are available, however, of Southside Rapid Transit Company Car Number 1, over 50 years after it was retired from service. This one elevated car was preserved and has been lovingly restored to its appearance as electrified in 1898, when it was a member of the world's first multiple-unit electric car fleet. From the first elevated structures built on the south side, elevated lines expanded westward with the Douglas, Garfield, and Lake Street lines, northwest with the Logan Square line, and northward with the North Side and Ravenswood lines, and also around the loop in the heart of the city. Was the site of the world's busiest railroad junction, located at Lake and Wells Streets, where over 1,100 cars passed in the peak hour. The four independent companies which had built and operated the elevated lines were officially merged in 1924 to form the Chicago Rapid Transit Company. Many of the earliest elevated cars were of the open platform type, where the conductors rode outdoors in all kinds of weather to open the gates for the passengers to board or alight. A fleet of 455 steel cars was bought in several groups from 1914 to 1924. The first group had center doors and steel roofs and bowling alley seating. Later cars had wooden roofs with trolley poles and walkover seats upholstered in green plush. majority of these cars were brought together to operate in the State Street subway after 1943 and remained there until new cars began arriving in the 1950s. Subway planning stretches back to the turn of the 20th century, but nothing came of the plans until federal depression relief programs of the 1930s provided funds to begin construction.
It was a momentous day in Chicago history when Mayor Kelly and Secretary Ickes shared honors in breaking ground for the first subway. The time, December 17, 1938. Of the $46 million cost, $18 million comes from federal PWA funds and $28 million from the city's traction fund.
Construction of the first line, the State Street subway, from Armitage Avenue on the north to Roosevelt Road on the south, involved digging out tons of Chicago clay and laying twin tubes in the bed of the Chicago River. Floated into position, the tubes were sunk into a trench dug in the riverbed. During World War II, planning proceeded on new rapid transit cars, but nothing could be built until the war ended. Then 4 3-section articulated cars were ordered. The first 2 arrived only months before CTA took over operations in October 1947.
These lightweight, high-performance cars utilized much equipment and designs originally developed for PCC streetcars. They were also the first L cars to feature curved sides, allowing more room at seat level inside the car.
More all-metal cars were needed to operate in the Milwaukee Avenue Dearborn Street subway, which was again under construction, having been stopped during the war, as well as to speed up service on other lines. The first group of a new family of cars utilizing many PCC concepts and designs was delivered in 1950. These two-car units replaced 50-year-old wood cars on the Logan Square line, which was then routed into the new subway in 1951. These first cars also appeared on the Ravenswood line. The old wooden L cars that had begun service at the turn of the century were slow and uncomfortable, as well as expensive to keep operating. A complete replacement was needed quickly to preserve ridership and entice others to return or begin to use the rapid transit. Many stations were abolished. AB skip-stop service was instituted, and remote door control was installed on the 455 steel cars of the 4000 series. All of these changes served to speed up the service. The need for new cars was painfully obvious, but how to afford them was a problem. The PCC technology was working well with the first 200 of the 6000 series cars, and the fleet of 600 nearly new PCC streetcars presented an enticing source of cars that might somehow be utilized for re-equipping the rapid transit system. The first plan was to rebuild PCC streetcars into rapid transit cars by cutting off both ends and adding new platforms and cabs. Many problems made this plan impractical. A plan was then developed in consort with Pullman Standard and St. Louis Car Company to sell the streetcars to the car builder, who would salvage usable parts such as trucks, control equipment, seats, lights, and other interior parts, recondition them and install them in new car bodies designed for rapid transit service. This plan was used successfully by St. Louis Car to supply 570 more L cars to the CTA, while allowing CTA to dispose of a like number of nearly new PCC streetcars. As more and more new rapid transit cars replaced old wooden cars and new buses replaced old wooden streetcars, the problem of disposing of all the old equipment arose. Since the cars were principally wood, the simple solution, in the days before air quality standards, was to burn them and then salvage any remaining metal. The burning of old equipment made good news, as it represented the arrival of modern equipment to serve the citizens of the Chicago area. The last 50 of the PCC L cars were single cars instead of married pairs, and had operators' cabs at both ends. 12 of them had trolley poles installed and were placed in service on the Evanston shuttle. One-person operation and on-board fare boxes were new features on the L. The 1950s also brought the first rapid transit line running in an expressway median strip. Planned before World War II, the West Side Superhighway was built in the 1950s. The highway right-of-way lay along the route of the old Garfield Park L, which had to be demolished. First, the buildings were torn down. Then the L was relocated to surface tracks for several miles while the highway and median line were built. Such a large project using public money attracted much publicity, and the late Mayor Richard J. Daley took considerable pride in being part of such a new concept in mass transit and highway coordination. Though shiny new rapid transit cars operated in the expressway median, autos ran much faster, traffic permitting. High-speed cars were needed. Early in 1960, St. Louis Car delivered the last 4 double-end cars equipped with innovative propulsion controls and trucks. These high-speed cars, capable of 70-mile-per-hour operation, were test beds for equipment intended for expressway median strip operation, where high speed was needed and would be a selling feature. Painted in a unique red livery, they operated in test service and gave demonstrations for several years. Then, in 1964, they were called upon to enter full-time revenue-earning service on the new Skokie Swift. Under the leadership of CTA engineer George Crambles, a plan was developed to restore service to the line, and a federal demonstration grant was obtained to pay for it. A fast, non-stop service using one-man cars was the plan. A remote-controlled pan trolley was developed to avoid raising or lowering trolley poles at East Prairie Road. The high speed of the cars, however, blew the pan off the wire, so an airfoil was added to provide lift and keep the pan on the wire. The 4 high-speed cars opened the line. Ridership exceeded all expectations, and more cars were pressed into service as fast as bow trolleys could be installed. Ridership kept increasing, and the 4 articulated cars were converted for Skokie Swift service. These 17-year-old cars had finally found a home, and there they stayed for another 22 years. Until 1963, the west end of the Lake Street line, from Laramie Avenue to Harlem Avenue, operated at street level with overhead wire instead of third rail. The antique character of the line was preserved with manually operated crossing gates and flagmen at each grade crossing, and a fleet of trolley pole-equipped cars. After decades of discussion, arrangements were made to move the surface operation up onto the parallel Chicago and Northwestern embankment, taking 2 of the 5 tracks. Modern stations and a new yard and shop were built, and operations moved upstairs. In mid-1964, the first of a new family of high-speed, air-conditioned cars began to arrive from Pullman Standard. These 180 cars of the 2000 series were dubbed New Look cars and entered service on the Lake Street line, bringing new equipment to join the new stations and the line west of Laramie Avenue, and allowing the retirement of all but about 80 of the 1920s vintage 4000 series cars. By 1967, major construction of median strip rapid transit lines was underway south in the Dan Ryan Expressway from the Loop to 95th Street, and northwest in the Kennedy Expressway from Logan Square to Jefferson Park. An order for 150 stainless steel cars from the Budd Company was part of the project. The dedication of the Dan Ryan line in June 1969 found Chicago's Mayor Richard J. Daley on the podium with Illinois Governor Richard Ogilvie and U.S. Senator Charles Percy. Through-routed with the Lake Street line, the new Lake Dan Ryan line was the longest rapid transit line in Chicago, 21 miles from Harlem and Lake to 95th Street, with a one-way trip taking about an hour. In early 1970, the extension in the Kennedy Expressway to Jefferson Park Station was opened. A short subway brought the line from Logan Square north into the expressway median. In the mid-1970s, another group of cars, this time bought from aerospace contractor Boeing Vertol, entered service, allowing a few of the earliest 6000 series PCC type cars and all of the remaining 4000 type cars to be retired. This group of 200 cars brought the first new cars with sliding doors to Chicago in over 50 years. They also sported wide red, white, and blue stripes along the sides. By the late 1970s, the 6000 series PCC type cars were 20 to 30 years old and showing all the symptoms of old age, as well as not being up to the standards of the newer cars for speed and passenger features such as air conditioning and lighting. A major car purchase was planned, and using federal funds, as had been used since 1967, An order of 600 new cars was bought from the Budd Company. Delivered over a 6-year period, these cars were placed in service on all lines and allowed the retirement of all but about 60 of the 6000 series PCC type cars. In the mid-1980s, the Kennedy Expressway line was finally extended, first to River Road in Rosemont, and finally to a spacious and dramatic terminal at O'Hare Airport. An award-winning architectural design incorporated rear-lit glass block walls the entire length of the 2-story high, 3-track wide station. Many travelers and employees can now get to the airport without fighting traffic or paying high parking fees. And when travel time from the Loop to O'Hare is an hour or more, the 40-minute train ride is a real pleasure. Many specialized pieces of work equipment have been needed on the elevated lines over the years. Line cars, including ex-North Shore 606, were needed for Lake Street, Evanston, and Skokie wire maintenance. So, Chicago's local electric transportation system developed from the late 19th century to the late 20th century. During that 100-year period, technical developments have been many, and though the system has often had financial difficulties, progress continued and service improved. The story and pictures are a fascinating epic in transportation history.